A single phone call made on February 9th, 1983, would unravel the most powerful criminal empire in American history and expose the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra to federal prosecutors in unprecedented detail. The call was placed from a construction site in Staten Island to a bakery in Manhattan, and it was recorded by an FBI listening device that had been authorized just weeks earlier under a rarely used federal wiretap statute. What could a casual conversation between two men discussing concrete contracts possibly contain that would bring down 5 crime families and rewrite the rules of organized crime prosecution forever? The man on the phone that morning was Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family and de facto chairman of the Commission, the governing body that had overseen Mafia operations in America since 1931. Castellano had inherited control of the nation's largest crime family from his brother-in-law Carlo Gambino 3 years earlier, and he ran it like a Fortune 500 company from his mansion on Tot Hill, nicknamed the White House by federal agents who surveilled it. He believed himself untouchable, insulated by layers of loyal soldiers and the time-honored tradition of omerta, the code of silence that had protected the Mafia for generations. But Castellano had made a critical miscalculation about how the world had changed, and that miscalculation would cost him everything. The mistake was not a single action, but a fundamental misreading of the legal landscape that had transformed around him. While Castellano and his fellow bosses had spent decades perfecting their organizational structure to avoid direct involvement in street-level crimes, federal prosecutors had quietly built a weapon specifically designed to pierce that corporate veil. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, had been signed into law by President Nixon in 1970 as part of the Organized Crime Control Act. For more than a decade, it sat largely unused, a legislative curiosity that most mob lawyers dismissed as too complex and too broad to survive constitutional challenge. They were catastrophically wrong. If you're watching this because you want to understand not just what happened in history, but why the mechanics of power and secrecy eventually fail, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down the real decisions and structural weaknesses that bring down empires, criminal and otherwise, one case at a time. The genius of RICO was that it transformed the Mafia's greatest strength into a fatal vulnerability. Traditional prosecution required proving that a boss directly ordered a specific crime, an almost impossible task given the elaborate protocols of plausible deniability that families had refined over decades. A boss never said kill him. He said take care of that problem, or simply expressed disappointment that a problem still existed. Orders filtered down through buffers, capos, and acting bosses, and trusted intermediaries who could claim independent action if caught. The structure was brilliant precisely because it was diffuse. But RICO made the structure itself the crime, under its provisions. Prosecutors could charge individuals not for committing a specific murder or extortion, but for participating in a pattern of racketeering activity as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Membership became the offense. The insulation became the evidence. Rudolph Giuliani understood this better than anyone. Appointed United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York in 1983, Giuliani had spent years as a prosecutor studying organized crime cases and growing frustrated with their limitations. He watched bosses walk free while their underlings took prison sentences. He saw the careful separation between decision-makers and violence, between ownership and operation. When he took office, he inherited a Justice Department that had finally, tentatively, begun to explore RICO's potential. FBI Director William Webster had authorized expanded use of electronic surveillance. The legal framework was ready. What prosecutors needed was evidence of the commission itself, proof that the 5 families operated as a coordinated enterprise rather than independent crews. That evidence began accumulating in the most mundane places. The FBI had bugged the Jaguar belonging to Salvatore Ruggiero, a captain in the Gambino family, and recorded hundreds of hours of conversations about heroin trafficking. They had installed a microphone in the dashboard of a car used by Anthony Indelicato, a Bonanno soldier, capturing detailed discussions about murder contracts. But the most valuable listening device was planted not in a car but in a building, specifically the basement of a tenement at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy. This unremarkable building housed a social club called the Ravenite, and it served as the headquarters for Aniello Della Croce, underboss of the Gambino family and Castellano's nominal subordinate. The bug went live in 1981 and captured something extraordinary: the operational vocabulary of La Cosa Nostra, the specific phrases and protocols that confirmed the FBI's organizational charts were accurate. Meanwhile, Castellano's phone call that February morning in 1983 was just one thread in a much larger tapestry that the FBI was weaving. Agents had secured authorization to tap his home phone at the White House, a legal breakthrough that required convincing a federal judge that probable cause existed to believe the residence was being used to facilitate ongoing criminal activity. The application ran to hundreds of pages, documenting Castellano's suspected involvement in labor racketeering, extortion, and control of the concrete industry in New York City. The judge signed the order. For the next several months, the FBI recorded every call that came in or went out. Castellano discussed construction bids. He talked about union contracts. He mentioned names, companies, percentages. He never said we are running a criminal enterprise, but he didn't need to. The pattern was unmistakable. Across the 5 families, other bosses were making the same assumptions about their own security. Anthony Salerno, front boss of the Genovese family, conducted business from the Palma Boys Social Club in East Harlem, where he met with union officials and construction contractors. The FBI bugged the club and recorded his conversations. Carmine Persico, boss of the Colombo family, was already in prison on other charges, but continued to issue orders through visitors and lawyers. Anthony Corallo, boss of the Lucchese family, believed his car was a safe haven for sensitive discussions. The FBI installed a bug in the Jaguar he was driven in and captured hundreds of hours of him narrating his criminal activities to his driver. It was an intelligence windfall. Corallo essentially created an audio book of Mafia operations, discussing commission meetings, vote tallies on major decisions, territorial disputes, and sanctioned murders. The commission itself was the key to Giuliani's strategy, established in 1931 by Lucky Luciano after the Castellamares War. The commission was designed to prevent the kind of inter-family bloodshed that had destabilized operations during Prohibition. It consisted of the bosses of the 5 New York families, plus representatives from crime families in other cities, though by the 1980s it functioned primarily as a New York institution. The commission set policy, mediated disputes, authorized the formation of new crews, approved the opening of new family books, and most critically sanctioned all hits on made members. No boss could order the killing of a made man in another family without commission approval. This rule was sacrosanct, the foundation of interfamily peace. That foundation cracked on July 12, 1979, when Carmine Galante, boss of the Bonanno family, was shot to death while eating lunch at Joe and Mary's Italian-Americans restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. 2 gunmen walked into the rear patio, shot Galante in the head and chest, and left his body slumped over the table with a cigar still clenched in his teeth. The photograph of his corpse, published in newspapers across the country, became one of the iconic images of Mafia violence. What the public didn't immediately know was that the hit had been authorized by the Commission. Galante had been flooding New York with heroin against the Commission's policies, threatening the delicate balance of power. His murder was a corporate decision, voted on and approved. It was also evidence of exactly what RICO was designed to prosecute, a criminal enterprise making collective decisions about illegal activity. The FBI knew about the Commission's involvement because informants told them. By the early 1980s, the Bureau had cultivated sources inside multiple families, men who had decided that the life no longer offered what it promised, or who faced long prison sentences and chose cooperation over loyalty. The most valuable of these informants was Joseph Pistone, though the families knew him as Donnie Brasco. Pistone was an FBI agent who had infiltrated the Bonanno family in 1976 and spent 6 years operating as a jewel thief and associate, getting closer to made members than any law enforcement officer in history. When the FBI pulled him out in 1981, fearing his cover was about to be blown, he had generated thousands of pages of reports documenting how the family operated, how decisions were made, how hierarchies functioned. His testimony would later corroborate what the wiretaps were capturing. Giuliani began assembling the case in late 1984. The evidence was overwhelming in volume but required careful organization to present coherently. Prosecutors don't just need proof of crimes. They need a narrative that a jury can follow, a story with characters and motives and consequences. The RICO statute allowed them to charge the bosses with running a criminal enterprise, but they needed to identify specific predicate acts, the underlying crimes that demonstrated the pattern of racketeering. The wiretaps provided those acts. Castellano discussing concrete bids was evidence of extortion and bid rigging. Corallo talking about a commission vote on a murder was evidence of conspiracy to commit homicide. Salerno negotiating union contracts was evidence of labor racketeering. Taken individually, these were ambiguous conversations. Taken together, presented as part of an organizational structure with rules and hierarchy and collective decision-making. They painted a picture of a criminal corporation. The indictment was filed on February 25, 1985, a date that federal agents would later call the beginning of the end for the American Mafia. Giuliani announced it at a press conference in Manhattan, standing in front of an organizational chart that showed the structure of La Cosa Nostra like a business flowchart. 8 men were charged: Paul Castellano, Anthony Salerno, Carmine Persico, Anthony Corallo, Gennaro Langella, Philip Rastelli, Ralph Scopo, and Salvatore Santoro. Together they led or represented all 5 New York families. The charges included extortion, labor racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution was titled United States v. Anthony Salerno et al., but the press called it the Commission case. For the first time in American history, the government was putting the Mafia's ruling council on trial. The defendants reacted with a mixture of disbelief and defiance. They had spent their entire lives evading prosecution through insulation and silence. The idea that they could be held responsible for crimes they had not personally committed, for decisions made in private meetings, seemed to violate the fundamental logic of criminal law. Their lawyers argued exactly that. RICO was unconstitutionally vague, they said. It criminalized association rather than action. It allowed guilt by organizational membership. Federal judges had heard these arguments before and rejected them. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals had already upheld RICO's constitutionality in earlier cases. The Supreme Court had declined to intervene. The statute was settled law. The defense shifted to attacking the evidence itself. The wiretaps became the battleground. Defense attorneys filed motions to suppress the recordings, arguing that the FBI had not met the legal standards for authorizing electronic surveillance. Under federal law, wiretaps are supposed to be a last resort, used only when traditional investigative methods have been exhausted. Had the FBI really needed to bug Castellano's home phone, or could they have built the case through physical surveillance and informants? The judge, Richard Owen, reviewed the applications and found them legally sufficient. The FBI had documented years of failed attempts to penetrate the families through conventional means. The taps were authorized. The recordings would be admitted. What those recordings revealed was extraordinary in its specificity. Jurors would later say that listening to the tapes was like taking a graduate seminar in organized crime. They heard Castellano explaining how concrete contracts were divided among a cartel of companies that paid tribute to the families. They heard Corallo discussing a sit-down to resolve a dispute between 2 capos. They heard Salerno authorizing a labor strike to pressure a contractor. They heard Persico calling from prison, instructing his subordinates on family business. The conversations were often coded, but the meaning was transparent. When Castellano told someone to do the right thing regarding a payment, jurors understood he wasn't talking about civic virtue. The trial began on September 8, 1986, in the federal courthouse in Manhattan. By then, Castellano was already dead. On December 16, 1985, he had been shot to death outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan in a brazen hit orchestrated by John Gotti, a Gambino capo who resented Castellano's leadership and saw an opportunity in his legal troubles. Gotti took over the family and became the FBI's next major target. But that's a different story. For the purposes of the commission trial, Castellano's murder simplified things. 1 fewer defendant meant 1 fewer lawyer, 1 fewer personality for the jury to track. The remaining defendants sat together at the defense table, old men in expensive suits, their faces familiar from surveillance photos, but their lives largely opaque to the public until now. The prosecution took 4 months to present its case. They called FBI agents who testified about surveillance and evidence collection. They called cooperating witnesses who explained the structure and rules of La Cosa Nostra. They introduced hundreds of hours of tape recordings, played in open court with transcripts provided to the jury. The government's theory was simple. These men were not independent actors, but members of a governing body that oversaw a criminal enterprise. Their collective decisions constituted racketeering. The defense argued that the conversations were ambiguous, that the witnesses were criminals seeking leniency, that the structure the FBI described was exaggerated or fictional. It was a hard case to make. The tapes spoke for themselves. On November 19, 1986, the jury began deliberations. They took 5 days to review the evidence and reach a verdict. On November 24th, they returned to the courtroom and delivered their decision, guilty on all counts for all defendants. The courtroom was silent. The bosses showed no visible reaction. Their lawyers immediately announced plans to appeal. Judge Owen scheduled sentencing for January. When that date arrived, he imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the guidelines, 100 years in prison for each defendant. The men were in their 70s and 80s. It was a life sentence by any measure. The convictions sent shockwaves through the underworld. For decades, the Mafia had operated on the assumption that bosses were effectively immune from prosecution. Soldiers went to prison. Capos occasionally faced serious time. But bosses were insulated, protected by layers of plausible deniability and the code of silence. RICO shattered that assumption. Suddenly, organizational leadership was a liability rather than protection. The very structure that had made the Mafia powerful made its leaders vulnerable to prosecution. The FBI had figured out how to flip the model. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. Families began restructuring, creating more decentralized operations to avoid presenting prosecutors with a clear organizational chart. But decentralization meant less control, more freelancing, more internal conflict. The commission itself ceased to function in any meaningful way. Without the bosses, there was no one to authorize major decisions or mediate disputes. Families turned on each other. The Colombo family descended into a bloody civil war in the early 1990s. The Bonanno family lost its seat on the commission entirely after the Donnie Brasco infiltration, deemed too compromised to be trusted. The Lucchese family fractured into competing factions. Only the Genovese family, which had always been the most disciplined and security-conscious, managed to maintain relative stability, and even they suffered high-profile prosecutions in subsequent years. The commission case also changed law enforcement strategy permanently. Giuliani's success demonstrated that RICO was not just viable, but devastatingly effective against organized crime. Federal prosecutors across the country began applying it to other criminal enterprises: drug cartels, motorcycle gangs, white-collar fraud rings. The statute became one of the most powerful tools in the federal arsenal. Subsequent Mafia prosecutions followed the same template, used wiretaps and informants to map the organization, identify the pattern of racketeering, charge the leadership under RICO. The results were consistent. By the mid-1990s, the leadership of virtually every major crime family in America had been convicted and imprisoned. But the deeper mistake the Mafia made was not legal or tactical. It was philosophical. The families had built their power on secrecy and insularity, on the belief that loyalty could be enforced through fear and tradition. They failed to recognize that the world around them was changing in ways that made those assumptions obsolete. Electronic surveillance made privacy an illusion. Witness protection programs made defection survivable. RICO made organizational structure a prosecutor's roadmap. The old rules no longer applied, but the bosses kept playing by them because they could not imagine an alternative. Castellano talked freely on his home phone because he could not conceive of a world where his private residence could be legally monitored. Corallo narrated his crimes in his car because he believed the Jaguar was a mobile sanctuary. They were wrong, and their inability to adapt destroyed them. There is a broader lesson here about the fragility of systems that rely on secrecy and coercion to maintain order. The Mafia presented itself as an alternative to the chaos of the market and the corruption of the state, a shadow government bound by honor and tradition. In reality, it was a protection racket enforced by violence and sustained by the exploitation of communities that had no other recourse. When federal law enforcement finally developed the tools and the will to dismantle it, the structure collapsed with shocking speed. The same organizational hierarchy that had ensured discipline and coordination became the mechanism of its own destruction. The bosses who believed themselves untouchable discovered that their power was always conditional, always dependent on the state's willingness to tolerate their existence. When that tolerance ended, they had no defenses left. Today, the American Mafia exists in a diminished form, a shadow of its former power. There are still families, still made men, still rackets in construction and waste management and loan sharking, but the era of the Mafia as a dominant force in American organized crime is over. The Commission has not met in decades. The bosses who once commanded armies of soldiers now struggle to maintain control over a few dozen loyal members. Many younger criminals have concluded that the life is no longer worth the risk, that the rewards no longer justify the scrutiny and the sentences. The mistake that Castellano and his fellow bosses made was thinking that their world was permanent, that the rules that had protected them for 50 years would protect them forever. They were men of their time, and their time ended on a February morning in 1983, with a phone call that they never imagined anyone was listening to.